Welcome and thank you for standing by. All participants will be in a listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's conference, at which time you may press star 1 to ask a question. I would also like to inform all participants that this call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the conference over to Ms. Susan Slickfield. Thank you, ma'am. You may begin.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Bond Guarantee Program overview and outreach session. So I think today you're going to get a lot of really great information. We have some good panelists on the line, and we will go ahead and get started. Before we get all the way in, I would just like to make sure that everyone knows that if you do have a question before we get to our question and answer session at the end, you can feel free to use the chat session. That you can either do to the host, which would just come to me, or to the panelists, and that would be filtered to myself, Wendy Dow, Brian Jackson, and Patricia Hessler, so that we can all see the questions and be able to give you a good answer. So today's session, you can see our schedule. We are planning a 4-hour session with a break right in the middle. For some of you that might have done this in the past in person, you know that this is typically a 2-day, all-day-long session, so we've tried to be respectful of everyone's time in the virtual setting and get it down into 4 hours, and we'll try to get as much information as we can to you during that time. So the first thing that we're going to do, obviously, is the overview. So as I said, my name is Susan Slickfield. I am the program manager. We do have Brian Jackson on the line, who is our lead for our credit and risk management unit. Also in the session today is Pablo Rykoff and Paulo Saka. They are both in our CRM team. In our compliance team, we have Wendy Dow, who is the lead of compliance, and she will be speaking to you this afternoon, along with Patricia Hessler, who is in our compliance unit as well. We have our portfolio and loan monitoring unit, and in that unit we have Brian Donovan and Malton Lightfoot Taylor. And then in our origination unit right now, that position is vacant, but Patricia Hessler, who is also on the line, is filling in for that vacancy for this time. All right, so what are we trying to do with these sessions? Basically, what we're trying to do is make sure that we're giving everyone the tools to be able to successfully understand the Bond Guarantee Program and to make sure that you have all the tools that you need to be able to submit an application to us. We're here to answer questions that you might have and to make sure that we're giving you all of the knowledge and the information to be able to access our program. All right, some of the topics that we're going to go into in this afternoon session include federal credit and CDFI bond guarantee requirements, what the various roles are with the different program participants and what your responsibilities are and how those relationships work together. We will go over qualified issue and guarantee application processes, and then we will look at current qualified issuer participants. So as we go through these slides, we are able to answer questions. Like I said, you can chat us questions either to the host or the panelists. We are blocking time at the end of the session today to be able to take those questions. And you can also always email us at bgp@cdfi.treas.gov. If you have any other questions that come up, maybe you think about it after the session and you have more questions, you can always email us and we will get back to you. So a little bit more of an overview before I turn it over to our team. So the CDFI Fund Bond Guarantee Program It is a federal credit program. What we're trying to do is provide long-term capital at a low fixed rate to certified CDFIs. You can find a lot of information on our website on cdfifund.gov. And at the top, if you click on programs and then bond guarantee, you can find a lot of our various documents. We did list some here on this slide that you can see. So on our website, you can get our NOGA, you can get our interim program regulations, application materials, secondary loan documents, and so forth. Right. So we are seeking with the bond guarantee program to achieve a bunch of different objectives. What we're doing is we're trying to promote community and economic development for low-income and underserved areas. Some of these areas include small business loans for startups or expansions, financing businesses that support job creation. We do have an asset class of CDFI to CDFI lending, and to provide financing of housing and community facilities. And all of this is to be able to provide this access to capital at a long-term and a low cost. Right, so with that, I am going to actually turn it over to the lead of our CRM team, Brian Jackson, and he is going to be able to go through some of the very detailed ins and outs of the program for us. And like I said, as we really get into the heart of the presentation, please let us know if you have questions, and we would be happy to answer those. Okay, Brian, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Susan. As Susan said, this is a federal credit program, so there are some overarching, let me start again. There are very specific program requirements and regulations, very specific to the statute, and again, the regs that come from the program. But there's some overarching guidance because it is a federal credit program, and we encourage all participants to be familiar or at least have hand to these particular requirements for federal credit programs that you can see here on the final bullet here. OMB Circular A129 and OMB Circular A11 are two that we encourage all current and new participants to review. Obviously, one of the overarching statutes are the Federal Credit Reform Act and the Uniform Administrative Requirements. And OMB Circular A136 and the U.S. Standard General Ledger, Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board, those are the guidance for internal agencies that are involved. Not necessarily for external participants. And then there's FASAP Technical Release 6, really, which is guidance for the program itself. It's less about guidance for participants. But again, I will ask participants to really focus on A129, A11, and A136. Next slide. So the Federal Financing Bank is the sole purchaser of bonds issued under the CDFI bond guarantee program. So the original thought when the statute was being formed was that the bonds or the loans from participants would have an opportunity to be marketed to the public or to private purchasers in the marketplace. But again, due to the standards of federal credit programs, this is a 100% guarantee by Secretary of the Treasury, so OMB requires that the Federal Financing Bank be the sole purchaser of the bonds. And if you're not familiar with the Federal Financing Bank, they do have their own website. It is an independent organization, but under the control of the Department of Treasury. Congress did not appropriate funding for any credit losses under the CDFI program. So what does that mean? If you're familiar with the term subsidy, typically federal credit programs allocate some budget authority for risk, for potential losses under the program. This program was not allocated budget authority for credit losses, so therefore there was zero subsidy. So a lot of the controls and the credit functions of the program are formed and designed to fit that requirement. Definitions under federal credit policy are specific and may differ from usage outside of federal credit. So all of our participants are effectively finance companies, individuals and staff that are used to lending into the marketplace. There's a certain vernacular that you're used to. We use a lot of that vernacular, but you'll find that there's a very specific language that is used for the program. So it's important to pay attention to those, and we'll talk about that going forward. So next slide. So again, 100% guaranteed by Secretary of the Treasury. The purchaser of the bonds, actually the lender is the Federal Financing Bank. The minimum bond issue, so every application for a bond issue has to be a minimum of $100 million. Now, participants within any bond issue have to be allocated a minimum of $10 million. So there could be as many as 10 participants in any bond issue. There could be just one participant per bond issue, but again, the allocation and the obligation needs to be a minimum of $100 million for that bond. And we'll talk about the difference between bonds and bond loans. The annual program-wide limit was originally $1 billion. That changes year to year, depending on OMB approval. What's authorized for FY 2021 is $500 million in total. And with regard to maturity, we'll talk about amortization and maturity of the bond itself, but it cannot exceed 29 and a half years. Next slide. Okay, so this is a slide that I usually, when we're face-to-face, we can usually manipulate this slide versus the next slides through slide 18, which actually show a lot of the definitions that are on this chart. But I'd like to follow, for people to follow within this chart first so they have a visual understanding of how the structure works. And Susan, we don't have pointers, right? I forgot about that, right? No, that's fine. We'll try to just try to follow on the best that you can. Starting at the top left of this, first of all, this particular chart shows several different things. First, it shows the key players, the key terms, the roles and responsibilities for each player, the key legal documents that govern the relationship between each one of these roles, right? These are not the only legal documents. I think there's something close to 30 documents that actually govern the entire program relationship, but these are the key documents that you'll want to take a look at. Most of them are available on the website. So we'll start at the top left with the Department of the Treasury, the CDFI fund, which it actually represents the Secretary of the Treasury in terms of managing the risk to the Secretary's guarantee. So that guarantee you see in the top left is to the Federal Financing Bank. The Federal Financing Bank has a program financing agreement between the Department of the Treasury and the FFB. We'll call it FFB from this point going on, because they're the purchaser of the bond and the one that takes the risk. However, again, all funding by the Federal Financing Bank has a 100% guarantee by the overriding agency. And in this case, it's the Department of the Treasury or the Secretary. As you go from Federal Financing Bank, you see to your right bond purchase agreement, right? So there's an overriding bond which has to be a minimum of $100 million, that the federal financing bank will purchase. Now, that agreement is closed as a dry closing. We'll talk about that more. But typically, the federal financing bank in most federal credit programs, if it's a $100 million bond, they purchase the bond and they give whatever entity obligor $100 million. In this case, the dollars are dry closing, and they're actually done on a drawdown basis going forward within the first 5 years of the closing of the bond. So we'll go through that eventually later. As you go from the bond purchase agreement and the bond to the qualified issuer. So the qualified issuer is a market player, and it's a pass-through entity that's part of the program that's tasked with managing the relationship between Federal Financing Bank, the CDFI fund, and the actual obligors, you, the applicant, or we call the eligible CDFI. So qualified issuer does program administration and servicing. If you look above the qualified issuer, it's the master servicer trustee. So there's both a master servicer and there is a trustee that actually controls the collateral, actually to a great degree controls management of the cash and of the entire program, and we call that a relationship is governed by a bond trust indenture. So below the qualified issuer, there is a bond loan agreement. So the actual obligor of this program are what we call the eligible CDFI, the actual CDFI applicants, the ones that are actually receiving the funding. And that relationship, again, the key terms for amortization, for how collateral is handled, for covenants, reporting relationships, reporting requirements going forward, those are governed by that bond loan agreement. So we like to call that the Bible between the eligible CDFIs and the rest of the program. The funding that comes from the Federal Financing Bank to any individual eligible CDFI we call a bond loan. So there could be, again, 10 eligible CDFIs in any $100 million bond. Each one of those eligible CDFIs request funding on a drawdown basis, and that drawdown basis is considered a bond loan. And obviously there's a promissory notes. There are promissory notes that govern that relationship, that commitment for the funding and the repayment of those funds. We'll talk about funds flow much later in this program, but it actually looks the same as this chart. It's specific to funding arrangements. Starting with the eligible CDFI, if you look to your right, is an escrow agent, right? So that escrow agent can be effectively any financial agent, typically a bank. It can be chosen by the eligible CDFI, and it acts as a collection agent for funding that comes from the secondary borrowers into the program. Below the eligible CDFI are the secondary borrowers. So each bond loan, each drawdown is covered by collateral, and that collateral are the secondary loans that the eligible CDFIs will pledge to the program, and the secondary borrowers are the actual obligors of those secondary loans. The secondary loan agreements are effectively the same documents that any CDFI would have between their borrowers. Those documents act as part of the collateral along with the obligation that secondary borrowers have to pay the eligible CDFI. Again, the funding does not work the same way. The funds that secondary borrowers pay to amortize their loans are actually paid to an escrow agent, and we'll talk about that later. This entire I would say, closed loop of obligations and cash flow we call the trust estate. So all obligations of the secondary borrowers and the underlying collateral, because each of those secondary borrower loans are in and of themselves also collateralized, are pledged into the trust estate. All right, we'll go next slide. Next couple of slides really kind of go through specific definitions that I pointed out on the chart. The bond issue, the bond, what a bond loan is, secondary loans or secondary borrowers. Next slide. Secretary of the Treasurer, again, is the guarantor, and the CDFI fund administers the program for the Secretary's guarantee. Federal Financing Bank, as we discussed, is overseen by Treasury. The Master Servicer Trustee, in this case, the Master Servicer is PNC Midland, and the trustee is BNY Mellon. Next slide. Qualified issuer, we discussed that. It's really a pass-through entity that does the very specific administration of each one of the bonds. The escrow agent, obviously, is a financial institution, again, usually a bank, that maintains escrow accounts and the funding from each one of the secondary borrowers. Eligible CDFI, that is the ultimate obligor, and the secondary borrower is who the eligible CDFI typically lends to, but now has that acts as collateral for the program. Next slide. And this should be the last one that talks about that chart. Again, goes through some of the legal documents that govern the relationships. Sorry, it's north of 30, it's at least 40 legal documents in total. Yeah, usually ask for questions here, but we'll keep going. All right, so relationship with other federal funding sources. I don't usually read these lines word for word, but we'll be close to that. The key to understand is it's expected that the obligation to the bonds for repayment are funds that come from the secondary borrower or other sources of funds. Those funds are received under any other CDFI program. It has to be clear, it may not be used to pay principal, interest, fees, administrative costs, or issuance costs related to the bond guarantee program. We expect you get those sources, again, from secondary borrower or from other sources. Bond proceeds may not be used to refinance a leveraged loan during the 7-year New Markets Tax Credit compliance period. However, we do allow the pledge of those leveraged loans into the program as secondary loans, but only after the 7-year compliance period has been completed. Bond loans cannot be utilized to finance a specific project of faith that also receives funds from the Capital Magnet Fund. They cannot be included. Bond loans may not be used to refinance existing federal debt or to service debt from other federal programs. And if other federal funds are used to service bond loan debt or as credit enhancement, the CDFI fund requires written assurance and agreement from the other federal program that the use is permissible. I think the one that's most often used is the Department of Education financing arrangement for charter schools. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about secondary loans and secondary borrowers being the primary collateral for the program. There are a myriad level of terms and conditions that CDFIs use for their borrowers. It only makes sense that CDFIs, and it's expected, will take typically more risk, have very specific terms depending on the type of lending they're doing or the region that they're doing lending in. in order for a secondary loan to be accepted as collateral for a bond loan, a drawdown, they have to comply with very specific terms and conditions and quality. And those are found in what we call the secondary loan requirement. There are two documents in the secondary loan requirements. One's called the general requirements, and the other one is called the checklist. And those can be found on the CDFI Fund website. Very important for those who are looking to originate loans that would comply with the secondary loan requirements, that their loan teams and their management teams review those closely, because most often they will not necessarily, those terms and conditions will not necessarily be standard to your particular go-to-market program. So, and the reason for that secondary loan requirement is to ensure the quality repayments from a reasonable source, and the use must be sufficiently capitalized to ensure completion of the projects being funded, and they're secured by perfected senior lien on pledged collateral. They're always first position liens. The loans are always collateralized by what we call appropriate secondary loan collateral. So they themselves, those loans, are secured. Secondary loan requirements are specific to each asset class. There are several asset classes, which we'll talk about for it, and those requirements for each asset class are found in the secondary loan requirements checklist. All right, next slide. So a little bit different over the last couple of years. When the program was originally structured, construction loans were not allowed as secondary loan collateral. And the reason for that is construction loans, as most lenders know, are very specific, high risk. They're usually not backed by finished collateral because it's a project in process. So they weren't previously allowed. Now you'll see in the secondary loan requirements and the general requirements that construction loans are accepted as secondary loan collateral, but under very specific requirements. And you can see most of it here. The start is there has to be a principal loss collateral provision. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But again, construction loans are typically not backed by a finished collateral source. So there has to be some substantial credit backing to that loan. And that's typically some financial institution. It can be a bank, and it's usually a payment guarantee in structure. But we came up with this structure because we saw the advantage of organizations, CDFIs, doing forward commitments, being able to lock in the advantageous rates of the FFB ahead of actually completing that particular project. So again, this is some of the requirements. This is basically just a synopsis of the requirements. There's a lot more detail to that, which we can talk about, not in this meeting, but on a go-forward basis. Next slide. So we talked about the closing of the bond being a dry closing and it being a drawdown loan. Effectively, after the original closing of each bond, within the first 5 years after closing, the CDFIs, so the ultimate obligors, have the opportunity or the need at that point to actually make draws from the bond obligation. There is a process we call the secondary loan process or the requisition process, whereby eligible CDFIs pledge a secondary loan in order to receive advances under the bond and bond loan commitments. That's an extensive process, something that we talk about after the closing of the bond and go through those details. But to make a long story short, effectively it's a way in a process whereby the qualified issuer and the CDFI fund will review secondary loan packages to ensure that they comply with the secondary loan requirements before accepting the pledge of that loan and approving that particular drawdown. Next one. So again, secondary borrowers actually do the repayment of the eligible CDFI through the payment deposits at the escrow account. The CDFIs will work with secondary borrowers regarding non-performing loans as necessary, and if the secondary borrower's payments are insufficient for the bond loan repayment, the eligible CDFI is responsible for making the missing portion of the bond loan payment. So there are either semi-annual or quarterly repayments that are made for the Federal Financing Bank. There's a very specific process for that. Those obligations, again, come from the cash flows that are paid from the secondary borrowers. To the extent that those cash flows are not sufficient, the eligible CDFI is still required to make that payment from other sources. Next slide. Oops. Did we go too far? Okay. All right, so secondary loan requirements. So there are specific asset classes eligible as secondary loans or secondary borrowers, and those are listed here. Those are, again, found in the secondary loan requirements, the general requirements. We talked about CDFI to CDFI lending, charter schools, daycare centers. What governs the asset class is the ultimate obligor or the source of cash for repayment of that particular loan. Now, there are very specific expectations with regard to the underwriting of each one of those asset classes. And those expectations are found in the secondary loan requirements, the checklist. And it actually goes through each asset class and what we expect to see with regard to underwriting for each one of those asset classes. Next slide. Okay, we got through that fast enough. So I think that's it. I see some questions coming up. I know that Patricia's going to address those. And then we'll address any other questions on this section in the end. For now, I'll pass this over to Wendy Dow for the qualified issuer application and evaluation process.
Yep, thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Brian, for the introduction of the financial structure, secondary loan requirements. So we're going to talk about the application process, which includes the qualified issuer application and how we evaluate those applications. And then we're going to dive into the guarantee application and evaluation process. So next slide. The qualified issuer application is reviewed, and that comes by itself, or it can come with the guarantee application. The qualified issuer application that comes with a guarantee application, of course, would result in the bond issue. But we do allow qualified issuer application to come in on its own. In other words, you can apply to the qualified issuer first, and then later on come with a guarantee application. But those that come with a guarantee application, it's kind of we will review as a priority. Next slide. So for qualified issuer applicants, the evaluation criteria we have is we want to see strategic interest in promoting community and economic development in low-income areas and underserved rural areas. And also, we want to see the capacity to perform qualified issuer functions and promote community and economic development in low-income areas and underserved rural areas. We will evaluate the applicant's proposed pricing structure and approve the qualified issuer application. Qualified issuer application and also the guarantee application are not evaluated under a competitive process. That just means we're not going to score the applicants against each other and see who's more, who has more favorable terms. As long as we see the capacity, for an applicant to be a qualified issuer, we will approve a qualified issuer. Next slide. So in the application, it's important for the applicant to demonstrate, to include the documentation of the capabilities that we mentioned about and experience of the applicant in performing the functions. So the later part of this presentation, we're going to talk more about, how the evaluation, is conducted and also how the documentation presented to us should focus. Next slide. This is a checklist for qualified issuer application. So you can see there are some organizational documents. We have some narrative documents about the qualified issuer applicant capability, and followed by bond issuance capability. And also we want to see the strategic alignment. And then we want to see the management and staffing related documents. And of course, we want to see the financial strength related documents. And there are some cash flow and pricing structure specific to the bond issue. So this is looks like a lot of documents. We're going to, go over some of them later. So you don't have to focus on line by line. But it's important in the application process to use this checklist and make sure, each of the items are addressed so that your application that you turn in is complete. And also the formatting of the documents is important too. So just a reminder to use this checklist. Next slide. So we're going to go over the evaluation process and go over the documentation in the application to make sure you have some clarity. So here's how we evaluate the qualified issuer application. We want to see specifically organizational capacity. We want a strategic alignment, alignment with the CDFI fund bond guarantee program with our mission and our goals. We want to see experience in the activities associated with the qualified issuer duty. We want to see management capability and staffing. You have staff-specific staffing levels that can make you fulfill these responsibilities. Of course, we want to see financial strength, and we want to see system and technical approach. So these are the important elements that we would evaluate an applicant for the qualified issuer. And these are also, a lot of these elements are very, very much in common with the guarantee application for eligible CDFI applicants as well. When all these criteria are met, that's when we look at the pricing structure to see if it's reasonable. If there's a third-party data source for an applicant, we do look at that. For example, some entities may be rated by ERIS, which is a rating service for CDFIs. We will look at the rating report. Or if an entity is rated by S&P, for example, we will look at those as well. And we do look at on-site review. Okay, so this is the overall summary of the qualified issuer evaluation, and we're going to drill down to a little bit more detail in the following slide. Next page. So this slide focuses on organizational capacity. So what are the capacity we're looking at? For qualified issuers, we need a qualified issuer to perform all these duties listed here in the lower part of this slide. We wanted the qualified issuer to have the capability to organize a deal, put a bond issue together, right? So support the guarantee application and issue bonds. And when a bond is approved, we want to see a servicing capability to service the bond loans, right? And we also need a qualified issuer to perform program administrator duty, look at the requisitions, make sure the reports are submitted correctly, they are submitted on time. There are a lot of duties, directing the escrow agent. So the program administrator duty is important. So in the application document, it is important to address the applicant's prior experience in those activities. The sample cash flow model will be helpful. It shows the proposed sources and uses for the bond, and show the capability to perform bond issuance functions. And if there's any independent report, the ratings, that would be helpful on the QI applicant or the QI applicant's contracted third-party servicer or program administrator. Those should be submitted. That would be helpful to the application. Next slide. For the next criteria in strategic alignment and experience, as we mentioned earlier, we want to see the applicant's mission statement, whether it's aligned with the CDFI fund's goal and mission statement. The qualified issuer will be evaluated on its knowledge of the CDFI industry. And their mission needs to be aligned with the industry's goals and policies. So although a qualified issuer does not need to be a certified CDFI, it needs to be familiar with the CDFI industry and how the industry works, how they function in supporting the community economic development. Next slide. So when we assess strategic alignment, we look at the track record and we look at the past experience relative to the activities we mentioned earlier, in loan origination, underwriting, loan administration, servicing, monitoring, loan structuring, financial reporting, lending activities in low-income areas. So these are the activities we are looking at to see if there's alignment with the qualified issuer duties. Next slide. So to show strategic alignment with the CDFI bond guarantee program, in application document, the applicant should describe the experience in working with the CDFI industry, and especially with regards to evaluating financial institutions' financial strength, the operations of the CDFIs, and demonstrate track record and commitment to the community and economic development. As noted in the notice of guarantee application, the track record and experience is very important. You cannot say, I'm going to apply and I'm going to reach this capacity and have this experience by, 2 years later. As noted in NOGA, we want to see existing experience to be able to administer the bond loans successfully. Any policies and ethics policies and conflicts of interest policies will influence the organization's alignment of interest. And those are the documents we will look at as well. And we want to see technical experiences tailored towards CDFIs or similar institutions. So you do not need to be a CDFI, but you need to be familiar with the CDFI. Of course, if you are a CDFI, that's really great. You already have a lot of this that we're looking for. Next slide. For management and staffing, the qualified issuer applicant should demonstrate a sound plan for managing and staffing their operations relative to the qualified issuer activities. The proposed management team will be evaluated on its past track record. And we will evaluate the applicant for the management and staffing stability, see if you have a succession planning going on in the organization. How is the turnover situation? Is there training for the staff, and other characteristics? Next slide. So we will, for servicing, some, qualified issuers submit application and then they may have a third-party contracted servicing, or they may decide to do the servicing of the bond loans themselves, right? So we will look at the management and staffing capability with regards to servicing of the debt and directing the escrow agent each month. So this includes, making sure the fees are paid to the various parties of the bond issue, making sure the principal and interest for the bond loan are paid timely, and making sure the amount to be deposited to the relending account is deposited. Although the relending account has not been utilized by any party at this point, everybody utilizes the over-collateralization structure to make it a little bit easier, more flexible. The qualified issuer applicants need to have the capability of servicing, either by itself or by contracting third party. So the applicant, in terms of demonstrating the servicing capability, need to have internal control in place as described in the statements on standards for attestation engagement 16, which is basically like internal control standards here for servicing organization. Next slide. For management and staffing, in terms of application documents, we look for organizational chart. We also look at management's discussion about the various activities, and we also look at the resumes, the job descriptions for the organization, and then the hiring data for senior managers and the participating entities that are contracted to be part of the qualified issuer application. The applicant will describe the current retention of management and staff, describe the staffing plan to the bond guarantee program. Next slide. For financial strength, the qualified issuer, is going to be administering bond issue for 30-year time frame. So it's important for us to make sure that the qualified issuer will have stability to stay around for that long time. We look at the financial strength for the qualified issuer, look at the funding and projected revenues associated with the duties of the qualified issuer to see if it would support the performance of the required qualified issuer duties. And we also look at any counterparty issues or credit concerns, including but not limited to off-balance sheet obligations, inter-affiliate relationships. Next slide. In terms of application documents, we look at 3 years of audited financial statements, including information on net assets, equity, or net capital. We look at financial risk and risk mitigation strategies, how the firm is managing the financials. And we look at the list of applicable regulatory agencies, as well as ratings, reports, or scorecards if the applicant is a regulated entity. We also look at financing transactions with a cumulative of $100 million or greater in the past 3 years. This gives us some idea whether, because each of the bond issues $100 million, this would shed some light on the capability for the applicant. Next slide. And we also need this additional information, on financial and operating covenants We want to look at the report of off-balance sheet contingencies, and we look at large sources of earned revenues. And we look at the budget for the next year, comparing with the current operation. Next slide. For systems and technical capability, for this criteria, the qualified issuer applicant needs to demonstrate adequate technical capability for systems and technology utilized in the qualified issuer activity. This is very important because sometimes the QI end up with many eligible CDFIs portfolio under their administration. So the capability is really important for us. The qualified issuer should have adequate backup and disaster plan for their systems. This is something we do verify during our site visit. The qualified issuer applicant should demonstrate in the underwriting process the capacity to service the lending they sponsor in the application. For example, if the eligible CDFI goes in default or go bankrupt, the portfolio end up being serviced by the QI. We want to see whether the QI has the capability to take over the portfolio and service it appropriately. Next slide. So in terms of application documents related to system and technical capability, the applicant should provide information on what's the IT environment for the firm in terms of program administration for servicing and monitoring. And also the applicant should provide internal control policies for us to review. The policies and procedures for management decisions and documentation of such decisions and loan servicing and administration documentation. These are things we would like to review and evaluate. Next slide. It's only when the capability we talked about, the financial strength, the staffing management, all the capability we talked about earlier, we see the capabilities there, that's when we start to look at the pricing. We don't get in between the qualified issuer and their eligible CDFIs in terms of pricing, but we do look at the pricing for bond issuance fees, for program administrative fees, services fees, just to get an idea to make sure that the fees are appropriate given the complexity of the services that's going to be performed under the proposed bond issue, and given the cash flow modeling, whether those fees will be appropriate, the amount of given the amount of activity. So that's the pricing part. Next slide. For application documents, it's important for the applicant to, in the pricing, be specific with the pricing structure to address each of the, fees in the guarantee application. Issuance fee, the servicing fee, the program administrator fee, and any other fees. They are usually expressed in terms of basis point of the interest rate of the bond issue. We want to see those basis points. What are they? The cash flow model submitted by the qualified issuer applicant should incorporate all those fees. But also, there are additional fees we didn't mention earlier, right? There's escrow agency, there's custodian fee, master servicer trustee fee. So this, the cash flow model should incorporate all that. Next slide. So we gave an overview for the qualified issuer review process, right? From submission, we move on to completeness and eligibility screening, and we go into substantive review. And then when the capability is established for the applicant, that's when we look at the pricing proposal and determine whether to approve or not approve. The approval for qualified issuer is within the bond guarantee program authority. So the program manager would approve a qualified issuer. If an entity is not approved, we would recommend withdrawal of the application. Next slide. So for qualified issuer application, the application should be submitted through AMIS. our CDFI funds award management information system. This is the link. And then once an application is submitted, you will get a control number in this format, fiscal year dash BQI, meaning the qualified issuer applicant plus whatever identifying number to follow it. If there's any questions, this is the contact information, BGP mailbox, and there's this phone number here. Don't worry about taking notes. We're going to be posting the slides on the website, so you'll have all this information for you. Next slide. For eligibility screening, I just wanted to mention in high level, this is exactly the same as we do the qualified issuers and later on the eligible CDFI application the same way, the eligibility screening. This is to conform with OMB Circular A129 that Brian Jackson mentioned earlier. We will screen applicants in terms of whether there's a delinquent federal debt, if there's any suspension, debarment, what's the compliance status with the CDFI fund? Is it compliant? Is it certified? All that. And if any party fails to pass the eligibility screening, if we have questions, we'll reach out to the applicant. If there's any issue that cannot be resolved, making the applicant not eligible, we will recommend withdrawal. So if we reach out for information, the applicant must respond in time frame that we establish for the request, or ask for additional information. But if the response comes too late, it would delay our review of the application, and we might have to move on to the next application. The same for the guarantee application we're going to mention later. Next slide. For substantive review, the qualified issuer will go through, financials and a lot of review of all the other information that's provided to us for evaluation. All these evaluation criteria that we talked about earlier, totaling 11 of them, they are kind of spelled out in detail in the 2021 Notice of Guarantee application on our website. Next slide. And we mentioned earlier the pricing is basically, a pricing and cash flow model is part of the review after the capability is established. Next slide. So we talked about whether it's approval or withdrawal. Approved parties will be, will be getting a notification from us. Throughout the application review process, you'll get notification from us in terms of whether you're eligible, whether you're complete, whether you're approved. This communication only goes to the qualified issuer applicant. That means if the qualified issuer applicant, has a third party contracted to perform other responsibilities for the qualified issuer, for example, for portfolio servicing, we are not going to notify those third parties. We're only going to notify the qualified issuer. Next slide. So that concludes the qualified issuer application and evaluation process. We are going to move on to the guarantee application and evaluation process. The guarantee application is basically the application for a bond, right? Application for a bond issue. So the guarantee application has two parts. There's one part that's completed by the qualified issuer, and then there's another part that's completed by the eligible CDFI, or if the qualified issuer is organizing a multi-party bond issue, then there will be multiple guarantee applications from each of the eligible CDFIs applying for bond loan. So the guarantee application, there are two main sections. There's a capital distribution plan. This is from the bond issue level. And then there's a secondary capital distribution plan. This secondary capital distribution plan, one comes from each of the eligible CDFI participating in the bond issue. Next slide. The capital distribution plan contains the documentation where the qualified issuer would submit about itself and about its operation to be considered for the guarantee. And it includes the qualified issuer's plan for lending the bond loan, dispersing the bond loan, servicing, and monitoring the bond loans. And the requirements are spelled out for capital distribution plan. They are spelled out in the NOGA, and also Brian Jackson mentioned about those requirements earlier in his presentation. Next slide. So this is a checklist for the qualified issuer portion of the guarantee application. The qualified issuer should use this checklist to make sure its application for the guarantee application is complete. Next slide. The secondary capital distribution plan from each of the eligible CDFIs participating in the bond issue should consist of two documentation submitted by qualified issuer for each eligible CDFI and demonstrate the plan for lending, dispersing, servicing, and monitoring of secondary loans. So basically, each eligible CDFI applicant need to demonstrate, if you get the bond loan, how are you going to do this lending, dispersing, servicing, and monitoring your secondary loans. Next slide. And this is a checklist for the eligible CDFIs in terms of submitting the guarantee application. So you can see there are a lot of common elements similar to the qualified issuer application. You can see the organization capacity document. We want to see all those very similar to the QI application, like a lot of the bylaws, the corporate, the company's or organizational document. And there is a policy procedure component, and there's contact information, of course, and there's cash flow model. And we want to see the financial statements. And we also want to see the eligible CDFI's portfolio, loan portfolio information. So that's different from the qualified issuer application. And we want to see the sources and uses of the funds. So this is a checklist for the eligible CDFIs in their preparation for the guarantee application. Next slide. So we are going to go over the evaluation of the guarantee application. This is kind of similar, the starting out of the process. The guarantee application, we go through the completeness and eligibility screening, make sure the eligible CDFI applicants are eligible. Past this two steps, that's when the guarantee application goes into the underwriting and credit risk evaluation process. And then it goes into the review and recommendation process for approval. If it's approved, then it would move on to close. We're going to step through this process in a little bit more detail in the following slide. Next slide. Okay. So this is like a high-level chart to talk about how the process goes. We talk about eligibility screening. As we mentioned earlier, it's the same as the qualified issuer eligibility screening. The underwriting, this is where it's going to be different because the eligible CDFI is the one or are the ones that's going to have credit risk for us, right? They're the one receiving the loan from the Treasury to deploy into low-income communities. So this is where we're really focusing on the credit risk, a very detailed underwriting here, including site visits, including credit subsidy calculation. And the review and approval includes OMB after the credit review board. And then there's Treasury Secretary there approving or disapproving a guarantee application. And then there's this closing process. We're going to step through the process. So let's go to the next slide. So the submission is the same. It goes through AMIS, and make sure you have the qualified issuer portion and then the eligible CDFI portion using the two checklists we mentioned earlier. And once the guarantee application is submitted, you will receive this control number, BFA, this control number. And the overall guarantee application will receive this BG kind of control number from the system. Next slide. Okay, so communication and application review process. Throughout the application review, the CDFI fund may contact the qualified issuer for clarification about any of the documentation submitted for guarantee application. The QI must respond to the CDFI fund's request for information and clarification in a timely manner. If the time we requested is not sufficient for the qualified issuer, the qualified issuer can request additional time. But then after that, if agreed upon, and the clarification must be submitted in time. This is because especially when we have multiple applications under review, our time is very limited. We must, finish review and also obligate the funds before the end of our fiscal year. So if we cannot move on a particular application, it gets stalled in there because of lack of response, then we may have to move on to the next application. The eligible CDFIs participating in the bond issue should not contact the CDFI fund because of just the overwhelming amount of work in both underwriting and also for monitoring the existing portfolio going on with the staff. And also, we utilize the QI to, collect all the questions and get answers. It's because the QIs may have multiple parties in the bond issue, and the QIs are knowledgeable, and also they can, aggregate all the questions to avoid the waste of time and, delays or anything. So good coordination using the QI. Next slide. We mentioned about completeness and eligibility screening earlier. So this is substantially the same. So we're going to move on to the next slide. Okay, underwriting. Underwriting, we will use established underwriting criteria. We look at the proposed bond issue feasibility. We look at the eligible CDFI's credit quality and lending policies and procedures, and any credit enhancements and principal loss collateral provisions that the bond issue is having to boost the credit quality for the bond issue. And Brian Jackson later this afternoon will we'll talk about the credit enhancements and principal loss collateral provisions in more detail. The CDFI fund, we may contact the qualified issuer during the process to clarify any application material. Again, timely response, very important. Next slide. Okay, so for the bond issue level, the underwriting and credit risk evaluation would include looking at the capital distribution plan, and we look at the eligible CDFIs also. Each eligible CDFI will be underwritten, so it's a very intense process. We will determine if any additional counterparties will need to be evaluated. A third party providing credit enhancement, any other affiliated party that will impact the risk profile of the applicant will evaluate. Next slide. So for eligible CDFIs, for each bond loan level, we talked about having a secondary capital distribution plan. We want to see the plan demonstrate the CDFI's lending, dispersing, servicing, and monitoring of secondary loans. And we evaluate the credit quality of the CDFI. So the evaluation basically is conducted on, CAMEL methodology, very similar to the bank regulators, meaning we look at the capital adequacy. We look at the assets composition, the quality, and we look at the management and organization, and we look at performance and earnings, and we look at liquidity, this is CAMEL, and we also look at each CDFI applicant's predictive financial ratio, the forecasted performance, the credit enhancement, and any other elements in their application. Next slide. We do conduct site visit due diligence. So the site visit really is not a audit. We don't audit you to find out whether we don't do as detailed as audit. It's basically to verify that the application material submitted, what you say is what we see. We try to verify those information. And the site visit also allows us to perform additional due diligence, and if we have any questions or any policy, how it's carried out, is the system sufficient given the proposed activity, we use the site visit to have a look. We'll walk around the office, look at the infrastructure. We observe the process. We hear the overview about the management practices. So the site visit usually is coordinated by the qualified issuer. Next slide. Very important part of the guarantee application review is credit subsidy calculation. As Brian mentioned earlier, the bond guarantee program is a negative subsidy program by regulation. That means we would, after we look at all the information the applicant presented, we look at the CAMEL evaluation, and we would hand over a lot of information to our Treasury modeling service for a credit subsidy calculation. This group will give us a calculation result. A bond issue must have a negative subsidy calculation result for it to be moved forward for us to recommend approval. If it's a positive, it's against the regulation. We cannot recommend approval. Next slide. So the credit review board is the first part of the approval process. Credit review board consists of a panel of non-political career civil servants. Every one of them in the board are experienced in loan underwriting and federal credit practice. The bond guarantee program led by Susan, and with the team, we would present the proposed bond issue to the credit review board. And we have our recommendation for approval. And the credit review board, after the presentation and answering questions, after we answer their questions, they would recommend either approval or withdrawal, or they may remit back to us for additional information, additional due diligence. Next slide. If the credit review board recommends approval for a proposed bond issue, that's when we present it to the Office of Management and Budget. Office of Management and Budget would look at the proposed bond issue, the terms, and also look at a credit subsidy calculation. That's very important because OMB is the one in control of the president's budget. If they have no issue, that's when we move on to get approval, final approval from the Treasury Secretary. Next slide. So the formal approval comes from the Treasury Secretary, and the Treasury Secretary usually delegates to our Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community and Economic Development Policy, the DAS, DAS-CED. Okay, that's an acronym we have for this position. So the DAS would approve or disapprove a guarantee, and after a DAS approves a proposed bond issue, the qualified issuer will receive the agreement to guarantee with a term sheet. The agreement guarantee is one document. The term sheet can be multiple documents if there are multiple CDFIs participating in one bond issue. So each eligible CDFI, would have a term sheet to sign. Next slide. Okay, so this slide talks about alternative financial structure. This structure hasn't been utilized by any party yet. Basically, it is a structure that the bond guarantee program came up with to allow the full recourse to the CDFI to be transferred to alternative financial structure to alleviate the CDFI's balance sheet concern. So it can be one CDFI being the controlling CDFI, or it can be multiple CDFI, acting as the controlling CDFIs to establish alternative financial structure and put in, secondary loans into the alternative financial structure as the asset. And this alternative structure has 120% over-collateralization requirement, but it alleviates the CDFI's own balance sheet burden. Because of the pretty high over-collateralization requirement, it hasn't been utilized. But it is an available structure if anybody wants to utilize it. So that's why we put it here. Next slide. Oh, okay. Well, we come to a break point. I'm going to hand it back to Susan.
Thank you, Wendy. So at this point in the presentation, we are ready for our break. We figured, after about an hour and a half, everybody needs a little stretch. So we are going to take a break. Why don't we get back here at 2:40 Eastern Time, which is about 15 minutes, and then we will continue. Just a quick note, if you send us a question in the chat, we are getting back to those as quickly as we can as they come in, and we'll be having a question and answer session at the end so that we can go through all of those. So 15 minutes, we will see everybody back at 2:40 Eastern. Thank you. of 2:40. So we will go ahead and get rolling again with our presentation. I know that there have been some questions coming in. Keep them coming to us, and we will be answering them. So after the break, I am going to go ahead and pass it on to Brian to get into some very exciting topics coming up. Brian, are you ready to talk to us about credit enhancements?
All set. All set.
Right. All right.
I know there were some questions on credit enhancements by last presentation. We'll actually brush over those here. Obviously, what you're getting is effectively a broad brush of very complex subjects. So, as an applicant or in other forums or another time, we could probably provide more detail. So let's go through the credit enhancement side. So this says credit enhancements in principal loss collateral provisions. So this is a challenging subject. Again, because of the depth and breadth of credit enhancements and something called a principal loss collateral provision, which is one of those terms that's very specific to this program. First, in general, credit enhancements we'll talk about here are about the underwriting or ensuring the credit quality of the obligor, that is the eligible CDFI. As you know, the guarantee application is about the eligible CDFI, who is the ultimate borrower and obligor. We are required by statute to calculate the credit risk on each obligor and the entire bond issue to what is called a zero subsidy score. And for many lenders, myself included before this program, don't spend a lot of time calculating subsidy for when they underwrite organizations. So this is where a qualified issuer can really help to understand what that really means in those organizations that are very familiar with federal credit programs. Because, again, every federal credit program goes through the subsidy calculation so that the government can allocate a budget authority for risk, for potential losses. In this case, this program is not allowed to project potential losses, so there is no subsidy calculation. So the underwriting in this particular case, the structure of the program is put together to focus on that limited scope for risk. Smaller organizations that apply may or may not have a challenge with regard to underwriting a corporate lending situation. Typically, the loans are short-term, and they're from CRA banks. In this case, we're doing a 30-year loan at very slim spread, and of course, no room for risk. So there may be a requirement for the obligor, the applicant, to provide other credit support. Again, qualified issuers are pretty familiar with the structure of obligors that may have this need. So let's kind of go through this. So again, this is the obligor. We'll talk about principal loss collateral provisions to a certain extent, but that's secondary. So credit enhancements may include, but are not limited to, payment guarantees from third parties or affiliates, lines or letters of credit, and other pledges of financial resources which enhance an eligible CDFI's ability to make timely debt service payments under the bond loan. Credit enhancements should be offered by credit-worthy providers and provide information about the adequacy of the facility and protecting the interests of the federal government. Next one. Okay, they must be documented as a part of the application material. So if there's going to be a credit enhancement included to support an applicant, it should be part of the application package. And for us to bring that into consideration, there needs to be a solid letter, commitment letter or letter of intent. And then we will require extensive information if it's, if it's a bank, the form or substance of that credit enhancement, if it's a foundation or some other substantial credit entity, we will also be doing some underwriting of that entity. Next slide. And we talked about credit enhancements being part of the credit subsidy score of a bond issue. And when we look at an obligor, that credit subsidy, the basic input to that credit subsidy is the probability that that organization will default. If you want to look at a default curve, we typically will use a similar default curve that Standard & Poor's use for entities. And you may want to take a look at that as an example of a default curve we'll use. As you can probably already surmise, most CDFIs are not substantial credit entities. They won't be scored as high credit quality by Standard & Poor's. We do have organizations that do have a public debt rating, AA minus, but most often the applicants will not score that high. So it's something to consider with regard to that as an example. So credit enhancements effectively look at that default curve and say, okay, this supports the either the cash flows or the balance sheet of that entity, and we include some credit to that support, and that actually raises or actually limits the probability of default for that organization. In the bottom bullet there, in addition, the CDFI fund will impose terms and conditions that address risks unique to the eligible CDFI's business model, and target markets include concentration of risk of a specific eligible CDFI. Example, BGP funding will be limited to no more than 50% of the CDFI's total funded debt. So there are two things that are pretty general across all borrowing entities in the program. One is over-collateralization. There's a level of collateralization with secondary loans that we may require as one of those levels of support that, again, is part of the program. There is also a limitation throughout the program that bond guarantee debt will be no more than 50% for ECFI's total funded debt. It's typically for larger entities. We'll look at that case by case, but that's the rule of thumb that we use in order to reduce risk across the program. Next slide. The credit enhancements are part of the trust estate. We talked about that large chart at the beginning. We'll refer to that again a couple times through this, where the trustee actually is the holder of all collateral that's pledged to the program, and that's included in what we call the trust estate. Anything that's pledged in the form of a credit enhancement, guarantee, cash or other forms of credit enhancement, a letter of credit, that will all be pledged into the program as part of the trust estate. You need to keep in mind that credit enhancements may require fees on the part of the guarantor or the source of the credit enhancement. That's not something that we are specifically involved in, but we need to know the terms and conditions of those credit enhancements because we include that in our evaluation of the overall credit. And again, for the most part, Fed funds from other programs are not allowed to be used as a credit enhancement unless specifically detailed detailed by the program and agreed to by the other agency. I think, again, we talked about Department of Education's our charter school program is one that we do allow. Next slide. To the extent that credit enhancements are utilized within the bond issue, again, terms and conditions need to be detailed up front. Information about the credit enhancement provider. We use an example like a substantial foundation that's well known. We'll also be asking for information from that substantial foundation because we will review them each and every one separately for each bond. Okay, I think that's it. Next slide. Okay. So credit enhancements are done on two levels. Again, in the application, we're really usually talking about the bond loan level. In this particular case, this chart goes back to the original chart of the players and the governing documents between the players. And if you look off to the right, there's a new governing document. There's a limited guarantee of payment by XYZ Foundation. It doesn't have to be the entire value of the bond or bond loan. It can be a portion of that, and it can have many different triggers. It can be triggered at when the risk share pool is down to a certain level, or there's a certain level of risk that's associated with the eligible CDFI that was not in the original underwriting. Usually what we prefer is a payment guarantee. So there's a requirement that eligible CDFIs, and we'll talk about this later, and cash flow make monthly payments in advance of the quarterly or semi-annual payment to the federal financing bank. If there's a shortfall in those payments, then that would be one area where a limited guarantee would come into play. And that structure would be put together at application so that all that is part of the closing when we finally close the bond. Next slide. And again, this really goes back to the chart. Third-party limited guarantee. In this case, our preference is a payment guarantee that ensures that or limits the chances of default. It can be for recovery, but that would qualify less than a payment guarantee with regard to underwriting and calculating toward the zero subsidy score. Next slide. Okay, so this is an enhancement at the secondary loan level. So we talked about this vernacular called principal loss collateral provision. And so let me try to show the difference. In this particular, in every case, the secondary borrower, the loan that's pledged to the program into the trust estate to the secondary borrower, that loan itself needs to be a secured loan. And there are certain requirements under the secondary loan requirements with how the structure of that collateral can be. The collateral listing is in the general requirements. It can be standard collateral like most organizations know, like real estate, inventory, accounts receivable, and there's certain LTV requirements and requirements for appraisal, so forth and so on. To the extent that collateral, underlying collateral, may be deficient under the secondary borrower, there can be a credit enhancement either in the form of a guarantee, a guarantor, to support or provide sufficient, what we consider sufficient support to supplement that deficiency. That support at the secondary loan level is what we call a principal loss collateral provision. So when you go back to the secondary loan requirements and you read the list of secondary loan collateral that we consider appropriate, the principal loss collateral provision will also be on that list. So the PLCP, again, a good example is a construction loan. Construction loans, in order to be pledged to the program, at secondary loans require a PLCP. And in this case, for construction loans, we ask specifically for letters of credit from a substantial bank. And that will support all payments that are due as a result of the obligation of the construction borrower to the program. Next slide. This basically talks about that previous chart. Limited guarantees for recoveries, effectively deficiency guarantee. Again, those don't qualify, as well as what we consider to be stronger, a payment guarantee. Limited percentage of recoveries on unsecured secondary loans. That can supplement deficiencies in underlying collateral. The third party should be able to provide guidance on lending to unsecured portfolios, so that third party has a exposure to that transaction, and we are assuming and expect that third party is able to underwrite and provide its own structure with regard to its exposure to the program, because the program will be calling on that third party to perform should need be. And such a guarantee will provide a floor for recoveries on a bond loan and allow for secondary loan security with principal loss coverage. So same thing. Next slide. Okay, so there's in the structure of the trust estate, I think Wendy talked about the risk share pool, and that's under statute. It's not something that we separately structure. Every bond and bond issue has the requirement for there to be a risk share pool a part of it, and that risk share pool is 3% of the entire bond obligation. And those payments are made into the risk share pool prior to each drawdown. So it basically increases over time. There are multiple parties in a bond issue. All the funding goes into essentially a collective risk share pool and is collectively available to supplement shortfalls by any party within a bond issue. Now, in this particular case, if a risk share pool is drawn to supplement a deficient payment by any party, there is an obligation for the eligible CDFI to replenish the funds in that risk share pool. If the eligible CDFI is unable to make that replenishment, then one of the structures you could put in place at application is to have a foundation ready and prepared to provide that replenishment if there's a drawdown for that particular eligible CDFI. Okay. And again, this goes back to the previous chart. Limited replenishment of risk share pool and based on a debt service payment, and that particular example includes a current default. And, there can be other structures proposed. Okay. Sorry. All right. I think that's it for credit enhancements. We'll talk about flow of funds next. Okay. Some of these terms you're going to hear over and over again. There's eligibility, which is key, right? Eligible community and economic development purposes. That eligibility is actually set in the certification of each CDFI, right? There is an understanding and agreement with regard to what's considered eligible community and economic development purposes on the part of each obligor that's set by the CDFI fund. There may be some portion of that CDFI's investment into community that doesn't fit with its original expectation when it became certified. The program does not set that requirement, right, that's set in the certification as a CDFI, but the program does go back to the statute for the CDFI fund to judge eligible community and economic development purposes of investment. Bond loan proceeds may be used to refinance existing loans. You do not have to make a new loan direct from funds from the program. We understand, given the structure of the program, that can be fairly challenging. So what many organizations do is they finance a loan through another purpose, through a CRA bank or internal funds, and then will pledge that particular loan to the program at a later date. As a bond loan is repaid, the bond loan proceeds in excess of those required for debt service payments may be held in a relending account and used for additional secondary loans. So that is part of the statute, the original statute. However, it was agreed through our legal team and through OMB that there need not be debt service payments held in a relending account as long as the eligible CDFI agreed to over-collateralize the obligation, right? And we talked about, to some extent, there's more information on that in the current NOGA. And eligible CDFIs may lend to other CDFIs provided that applicable bond loan and secondary loan requirements are satisfied. That's one of our expectations when the program was first stood up, that there would be lending to other CDFIs. CDFI lending is one of the listed asset classes, and the requirements for underwriting and structure are in the secondary loan requirements, the checklist. Next slide. And you'll see this in every term sheet. It's in every bond loan agreement. It's part of A129 and A11. Some of what bond proceeds may not be used for, and that's not necessarily specific to this program. It's specific to, that's broadly required of most, if not all, federal credit programs. Okay, next slide. Flow of funds. So again, this is the same chart, effectively, that we had at the beginning of the presentation. But in this particular case, along with the players and the documents that govern the relationship between each player, we're going to show how funds flow. And this is where it always comes back to that pointer. We need to have that kind of process here. But we'll do our best here, what we have. So look at the top left, Department of the Treasury, the CDFI fund. So the CDFI fund itself doesn't get any actual funding or make any actual funding in the program. You look underneath, it's the federal financing bank that actually makes the funding as a return for purchasing the obligation or the bond. There was a question, I think, outstanding, maybe we'll address that later, about tax-exempt bonds and, the benefit to investors. There are no third-party public or private investors in this program. The only quote-unquote investor is the federal financing bank. That's it. And they're required to take the bond under certain circumstances as part of its duty to the Department of the Treasury. So you can see there's a very light blue line called disbursement. To the left of the federal financing bank goes all the way up to the top and actually shows that flow of funds, that disbursement, going to the master servicer trustee. So the master servicer trustee holds account in BNY Mellon at the bank. The master servicer, PNC, actually manages the trigger or the management of the cash flows for those and generates reports with regard to that. There are accounts at the trustee for each and every eligible CDFI, and that's where the money goes from the federal financing bank into that account. On every drawdown, once that drawdown is made into that account, the master servicer and trustee will then release those funds to the eligible CDFI. So if you look to the right of the master servicer trustee, there's that light blue line again called disbursement. Goes all the way down the right to the bottom, and the funds are actually to be made to the secondary borrowers directly or to the eligible CDFIs, which we assume those funds will again go to the secondary borrowers. If you're refinancing a loan, a secondary loan for the pledge to the program, typically those funds will actually go to the eligible CDFI. So they can go to either one that's designated by the eligible CDFI. However, at the secondary borrower level, all the way at the bottom, the secondary borrower's loan obviously amortizes. We won't go into detail on amortization requirements here, but safe to say all funds for repayment go to an escrow agent. They do not go to the eligible CDFI in any way, shape, or form. So it's a very closed loop for the trust estate. And then it's the escrow agent that's given specific instructions by the master servicer trustee on how to handle those repayments. We'll talk about a little bit more detail going forward, but those repayments are held under certain timing periods to ensure that there's enough funds to make the quarterly or semi-annual payments for the benefit of the federal financing bank. Those payments, if they're done quarterly, are then made from the escrow agent. They go from repayment, that green line, back to the account for the master servicer trustee for the benefit of the federal financing bank, and then those payments, again, a green line for the master servicer trustee goes to the federal financing bank. There are other fees that are associated with this that are actually handled by the escrow agent in accordance with instructions that are agreed to by the master servicer trustee and the CDFI fund. We'll go through that later. Next slide. Okay. Want to repeat, minimum of $100 million per bond, $10 million minimum for each bond loan or each CDFI. Closing the bond, issuing the bond loans occurs simultaneously. They're dry closing. There's a drawdown basis. Next slide. Effectively, the qualified issuer is doing the lending, but it's really just a pass-through from the federal financing bank. So there's no obligations, not on the balance sheet, on the qualified issuer. It's definitely on the balance sheet of the eligible CDFI, that obligation. Again, we talked about drawdown loans, and CDFIs are doing their standard lending. They're just, the source of funding has changed if they're refinancing and principal payments of the bond loan are retired permanently. There's no reborrowing under this program. All amortization is straight line amortization for the 29.5-year period at max. It can be shorter periods. But once the payments are made, there's no reborrowing. Next slide. So we talked about maturity, interest rates. Okay, this is a little bit more complex, but we'll do our best here. So one of the advantages of this program is that the Federal Financing Bank effectively lends at the equivalent Treasury rate, so plus some spread. So what the borrower is getting is effectively the similar rate or the basis rate that the government gets. And those rates can actually be found on the yield curve on Treasury's website. There is a liquidity premium. We call it a liquidity premium or spread that is added for the purposes of the program, and that's dependent upon underwriting for each bond issue. And once that liquidity premium is set at underwriting, it is the same for the entire program duration for that particular bond issue. The underlying Treasury rate for the bond relies upon corresponding rates at the time. So when you look at Treasury yield curve on the website, it's not exactly going to be matched to the rates you would get from Federal Financing Bank because those are not amortized, fully amortizing rates that are on the yield curve. What Federal Financing Bank will do is on a daily basis provide rates specific for the program, the Treasury equivalent rates because of the amortization. I think that the secondary loan interest rates will be, yes, secondary loan interest rates are set by eligible CDFIs. Those loan rates and spreads, those are completely up to the eligible CDFI in accordance with your own program requirements, market rates, so forth. So, next slide. All right, again, bond and bond loans amortize on a level debt service payment. Each advance of funds amortizes independently. So there's a 5-year period of drawdown. You can draw under certain limitations that are set by Wendy's team. So you will have several bond loans outstanding at any one time that have different maturities. No more than the 29.5-year maturity of the bond. So those independent amortization rates are actually allocated and collapsed by the Federal Financing Bank so that no matter how many bond loans you have outstanding that are amortizing, there's one total payment schedule that's set up. You manage principal and interest payments through an escrow account, and you determine secondary loan amortization. Again, those schedules, are based upon your own underwriting. And then I think underneath that, very low, below the last bullet, I think at application, and Wendy mentioned this, there's a cash flow model that you present to us at application that shows what your expectation is that, cash flows in, cash flows out over really the entire period of the bond. That's really just to show you, the applicant, the complexity required to manage those cash flows. We don't expect those to be the same throughout the life of the bond. Of course, those will change, and you update those cash flows on an annual basis so that we can, for planning purposes. Next slide. Okay, fees and costs. So prior to the disbursement of funds from the FFB, each eligible CDFI contributes to the risk share pool. We talked about the 3% for each before each drawdown, and those funds are from sources other than bond loan proceeds. And eligible CDFIs will disperse the bond loan proceeds when the pledge is done and accepted and approved. Eligible CDFIs are responsible for bond issuance fees. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then up to 1% of the bond loan proceeds may be used to finance bond issuance fees. So you may have issuance fees up front that you can borrow from the program in order to provide. But again, that's a little challenging because you still have to pledge collateral in order to make that drawdown. Next slide. Bonds are non-recourse to the qualified issuer. We said that before. Qualified issuer is really just a pass-through. Bond loans are fully recourse to eligible CDFI. That should be pretty clear. There's another entity program in the program we call an alternative financial structure. We won't be going through that today. But that term sheet and example is on the website. Security bond loans are secured by security lien on collateral, typically the secondary loans, right, and the underlying collateral, which are all part of the trust estate. And then all collateral associated with the bond guarantee program is held by the master servicer trustee. So there is a master trust agreement, whereas all collateral that's pledged to the eligible CDFI and then further pledged to the program is identified as being part of the trust estate and is available for the program if needed. Next slide. So this is really an example of some of the fees and costs you can be expected to see as a part of the program. If you look, this is a tough slide to read. If you look at the boxes that are shaded, they're essentially the predetermined costs, the ones that you can pretty much know what they're going to be prior to and at closing. So there's a master servicer trustee fee that's already been negotiated for every program participant. There's an agency administrative fee that's part of the statute. There's obviously the risk share pool funding, which we consider a fee because it's held through the duration of the obligation. There's a liquidity premium that is a spread above the Treasury funding that you receive, the Treasury-based funding that you receive, that's determined at underwriting, underlying rate of the bond. Again, that's determined by Federal Financing Bank. And there are prepayment penalties or discounts. So there is not really an option to prepay under this program. Let's put it this way, there's a limited option for prepayment, which we don't go through here. We'll go through for each applicant, to the extent that we provide them detailed information as an applicant. But so there are penalties or discounts if you decide to prepay. So they're fixed wholesale loans from the Federal Financing Bank. They're not typically available for prepayment under most situations. Above that, the lines that are not shaded are fees that you can expect to be associated with the program, but these are not fees that the CDFI fund administers. They're all just simply collected by the master servicer trustee in accordance with agreements with qualified issuers or other servers, independent services. Next slide. The requisitions for bond proceeds, we talked about that. The drawdown loans are done by requisition process, where the secondary loans are pledged or proposed to be pledged to the program. We review those for compliance with the program in those requisitions, and they are approved by the CDFI fund staff. And again, you can only request proceeds up to the amount in the bond issue, and CDFIs are responsible for paying issuance fees. Next slide. All right, we talked about the drawdown period being 5 years. Effectively, the program obligation is no more than 29.5 years from closing. You have up to 5 years to draw down the entire allocation. If you do not draw down the entire allocation within that period, the rest of the funds after that period are no longer available. Okay. There's a test that our compliance team goes through in the first 2 years that shows that the eligible CDFI in each one of those first 2 years has the capacity and the planning to draw down 100% of those funds. There's a 50% requirement test on the first 12 months and the final 100% in the first 24 months in that test. All right, next slide. And this actually goes through more detail of that same chart, right? So the commitment tests have to be passed in the first 2 years, or the funds that are remaining can be forfeited. And there's a 5-year drawdown period where you must use the funds, or whatever is remaining has been forfeited. Next slide. The commitment requirements are specific to the eligible CDFI, not to the bond issue as a whole. So each bond loan obligation for each eligible CDFI is tested for that CDFI only. Even if there are multiple CDFIs in a bond issue, it's each eligible CDFI that has its own test that goes through an example of that test here. And the same thing for the 60-month or 5-year disbursement period. And it shows the regulation that actually shows why there's that 5-year disbursement period. Next slide. With share pool funding, we kind of went through this, go through this in detail. So each eligible CDFI is responsible for capitalizing its allocated share of the 3% risk share pool. Bond proceeds may not be used for the risk share pool. You have to get it from other sources. The risk share pool for a bond issue will be funded pro rata. Again, the risk share pool must remain in place throughout the term of the guarantee, and it's refunded when the entire bond issue is repaid. So there are multiple eligible CDFIs in a bond issue, even though one eligible CDFI may have repaid its obligation. The risk share pool funds are still held until all eligible CDFIs have made their required repayments under the bond issue. There is some level of interest and some level of investment. There's a requirement for the level of investment in the risk share pool, so that interest earned is returned on a pro rata basis to each eligible CDFI at the end. And it actually shows you the 1326 group treasuries. I think it's actually managed by the master services trustee. Next slide. I think we talk about the account for the risk share pool and master services trustee. Funds in the risk share pool is specific to the bond issue, no cross-collateralization in that case. But the use of the risk share pool is on the behalf of, is really for the CDFI fund's use to support the secretaries guarantee. So in any one bond issue, all the funds in the risk share pool will be used to supplement short-term shortfalls. Next slide. This kind of goes through the disbursement process. From left to right, the eligible CDFI commits secondary loans, and they capitalize the risk share pool, qualified issuer issues the bond, this is after closing, FFB purchases the bond, and that's the direction of the qualified issuer. The FFB disperses funds to the eligible CDFI, that's again upon requisition during the drawdown, and the bond loans are used to finance secondary loans. We call that a financing, though those funds may not go directly to the secondary borrower. It's the refinancing of a secondary loan that's already outstanding and being pledged from the books of the eligible CDFI. Next slide. And basically goes through that previous chart. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So the cash flow waterfall, to catch up here, which I think is nearly endeared to everyone concerned. So in the process of repayment, again, there is a quarterly or semi-annually bond payment that's due to the Federal Financing Bank. That's actually paid through the Master Servicer Trustee. That bond payment is actually made to the Master Servicer Trustee on a monthly basis. So if there are semi-annual payments that are due to the Federal Financing Bank, there are 5 months worth of payments or loan deposits that are made to the Master Servicer Trustee, such that 1 month prior to the bond payment being due, the funds available for that are already at the Master Servicer Trustee. There is effectively a monthly billing process that is managed by the Master Servicer and issued to each eligible CDFI and their corresponding escrow agent. That amount includes projected interest and principal and fees that will be due on that quarterly or semi-annual basis. So effectively, the entire bond loan payment consists of not only P&I, but fees that are due to the program parties or other parties. As you go down that list, you see the Master Servicer Trustee is first on that list. Bond debt service is second, the P&I. Any redemptions that are required, any guarantee that need to be repaid. Then there's the risk share pool, to the extent that the risk share pool has been drawn, and there are repayments that are due. That is the next echelon on the waterfall. The lending account, to the extent that it's been used, again, the relending account is always set up, but typically not used if over-collateralization is maintained. And then to the qualified issuer and agency admin fees. And these funds on a monthly basis that are more than sufficient to maintain that waterfall go back to the eligible CDFI. So if you're doing 6% interest to a slew of secondary borrowers, and the obligation for the Federal Financing Bank plus fees is significantly lower than that, you can expect there to be more cash than necessary to maintain loan deposits, and those funds will go back to the eligible CDFI on a monthly basis. When the we call the OC, or over-collateralization test, is done on a monthly basis. Yeah, I usually ask for questions after this, but I think we'll have to wait to the end. So, next slide. And this really goes, again, through that cash waterfall. It just details what I just kind of went through. Okay. I think I can take a breath, and I can pass that over to back to Wendy.
Okay. So we talked about all the program requirements, how the credit enhancement works, and what are the cash waterfall. And we're going to talk about the closing requirements, the application and closing requirements, the timeline. So for fiscal year 2021, all the bond issues must be approved and closed by December 31st, 2021. So if you submit a application or you are planning to submit application, you have to make sure you are available, to respond to any questions, and also the legal counsel that you designate, no matter if it's a qualified issuer or the eligible CDFI's legal counsel, they must be available at the closing timeframe. As Brian Jackson mentioned a couple of times, the closing of the bond issue is a dry close, meaning there's no cash that changed hands at the close. Disbursements happen after the bond closing. The bond loan agreement spells out conditions for initial and subsequent disbursements. So a lot of legal documents need to be executed to close the bond. These are some of the important documents that Brian Jackson mentioned when he went over the bond guarantee program structure chart. So first of all, we have agreement to guarantee. This is basically the document that's signed by the Treasury Secretary and the qualified issuer establishing the guarantee. And then the term sheet, one term sheet for each of the eligible CDFI participating in the bond issue. And there are a lot of other bond documents, right? Bond loan agreement, which is more detailed than the term sheet, spells out all the conditions and terms for the eligible CDFI to receive a bond loan. And bond purchase agreement. This is between the Treasury Secretary, the Federal Financing Bank, the qualified issuer, and the CDFI fund to establish Federal Financing Bank's purchase of the bonds issued by the qualified issuer. And then there's bond trust indenture. Brian Jackson mentioned about this bond trust indenture between the qualified issuer and the master servicer trustee, establishing the trust estate for the bond issue. And then there's this escrow agreement. This is signed between the qualified issuer, the eligible CDFI, and the escrow agent to be able to fulfill the responsibilities associated with the bond loan agreement, including cash management, custody of documents. And there are other bond documents and bond loan level documents, over 40 of them to be able to close a bond issue. So the drop dead deadline is December 31st, 2021. Next slide. Sometimes when we cannot fully close, we do the closing through two steps. This happened, for example, in 2019 when we had a bond issue that went through, extended time period of the underwriting due to some of the changes in the middle of the underwriting. So what we did in that circumstance, it's described in this slide. Basically, we would, before September 30th, we would have the agreement to guarantee signed, and the term sheet will be signed by the eligible CDFI to lock in and obligate the funds. Make sure we have that budget for this bond issue. And also, there's something called designation notice. This is basically the Treasury Secretary telling the Federal Financing Bank, hey, we have this bond issue coming. This is the high-level information about the bond issue, putting the Federal Financing Bank in place, ready for that bond purchase. So those three documents, three types of documents are important to lock down on the bond issue by September 30th. If we cannot close for any reason, and if there's a significant amount of time that passes, for example, if it's over 3 months, then we might have to do a refresh review of the underwriting to see if there's anything material that happened during those months. Is that bond issue still okay? We would do that refresh review. And by the end of the year, no later than December 31st, we would have all the remaining bond documents and bond loan level documents signed. Bond trust indenture, bond loan agreement, collateral assignment, UCC financing, all kinds of documents signed. Until close, the guarantee is not effective, meaning you cannot disperse any bond loan proceeds until after the closing. Actually, after the closing, because there are some initial conditions for disbursement, for example, you need some certification, you need some legal opinion, usually some time would lapse after the bond close before the first disbursement can happen. Next slide. Okay, so important dates to remember for this year. For a CDFI that's not certified by the CDFI fund, and also for CDFIs who want to establish this alternative financial structure to act as CDFI, the certification is going to go through the main compliance unit in the CDFI fund, a CCME unit. The CCME unit certification deadline would be April 2nd, 2021. For this year's bond participation. And then the qualified issuer application must be received by April 26th. Guarantee application, which includes both the qualified issuer's part of the guarantee application and then the CDFI's part of the guarantee application, must be received by May 3rd, 2021. So that's a high-level timeline here. It's a little bit kind of late, this year and the last year, comparing with all previous years, a little bit late. A little bit kind of a crunch here if we get a lot of applications, but these are the timelines to remember. Next slide. Okay, so finally, we would like to highlight some of the reporting requirements. These are not going to be all the reporting requirements. Typically, for any given year, if we get new program participants, we would also in the fall hold a mechanics meeting to talk about all the program requirements, all the details, so that the qualified issuer and newly approved eligible CDFIs know how to go about the various bond-related activities, including disbursement, reporting, etc. So this year, we're going to do some highlights for some unique reports, meaning they are unique to bond guarantee program. Next slide. Why are we collecting reporting? So first of all, we have the regulation, 12 CFR 1808, Section 619 has some information reporting collection requirements. We also have bond loan agreement detailing the eligible CDFI's information reporting requirements in Section 5. The agreement to guarantee details all the qualified issuers' information reporting requirements. The bond trust indenture details the reports that will be provided by the master servicer trustee For example, the master servicer trustee would issue reports on the bond loan payments, the advances that happened, and also the master servicer trustee would do monthly over-collateralization tests as required under the bond loan agreement. So those are the sources where the information reporting requirements are detailed. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because the OMB Circular A129 established the policies for federal credit programs, and A129 requires federal credit programs to establish a robust structure for risk monitoring, and also program decisions need to be data-driven, and also the impact need to be data-driven. So that's why we are collecting information here. We implement standardized data collection on top of some other collections, such as each eligible CDFI financial statement. So the standardized data collection allow us to look at any given entity in a very transparent way, and you can compare parties. The ratios from party to party would make sense. So each of the form we have reports have gone through the OMB Paperwork Reduction Act process, getting approval through the Treasury and through OMB. So all these reports that's submitted to the bond guarantee program not only helps with the program management, it also helps us in terms of looking at the future lending and investment. So it's important source of decision making for the future purposes as well. Let's go to the next slide. So one report I wanted to highlight is a pledge loan monitoring report. As Brian Jackson mentioned, each of the bond loan proceeds disbursement include ECDFIs pledging secondary loans to us. So this pledge loan monitoring report captures information for all the pledge loans from any eligible CDFI. This is a monthly report, and it would be completed by the eligible CDFI and reviewed by the qualified issuer. The report includes, who's the eligible CDFI, what's the loan number, what's the secondary project information, the project address, who's the secondary borrower, and then the loan information, the original UPB, the current UPB, the interest rate, the payment information, when was the last payment received, has the loan been restructured, so all that information. So it describes, the terms, the risk, and the collateral profile of each pledge loan. That's what it is. And it gives us a real-time monitoring of our portfolio. And the deadline for the pledge loan monitoring report is no later than 5 calendar days after each bond loan deposit date. The bond loan deposit date is 15th of the month or the next business day. If the 15th of the month falls on a weekday. So that means the eligible CDFI submit the pledge loan monitoring report roughly on the 20th of the month. So this report is official record used by the master servicer trustee to do the monthly over-collateralization test, determining whether the eligible CDFI is in compliance with the bond loan term. The next report I wanted to highlight is tertiary loan monitoring report. Some eligible CDFIs utilize the CDFI to financing entity asset class, therefore having tertiary loans to collateralize the secondary loans they pledge to us. So the tertiary loan monitoring report is developed following the pledge loan monitoring report format in Excel, and it provides the data similar to the pledge loan monitoring report about the tertiary loans. A little bit different from pledge loan monitoring report. Tertiary loan monitoring report includes the month-end over-collateralization calculation done by the eligible CDFI, calculating the over-collateralization between the tertiary loans versus the secondary loans. Whereas in the pledge loan monitoring report, there's no OC calculation. The OC calculation at the eligible CDFI level is done by the master servicer trustee. So that's the main difference. The bond loan agreement would spell out the frequency of the tertiary loan monitoring report, whether it's quarterly or monthly, depending on the asset class the eligible CDFI uses for the tertiary loans. Usually for home mortgages, it will be monthly submission for tertiary loan monitoring report. So that the frequency can vary between CDFI to CDFI, depending on the tertiary loan asset class. Next slide. The financial condition monitoring report is completed by the eligible CDFI, just like any other report, and reviewed by the qualified issuer. So it's basically a way for the eligible CDFIs to fill in Excel workbook template using the financials from the eligible CDFI. We require this on top of submitting the quarterly and annual financial statement because eligible CDFI financial presentation can vary from entity to entity. Our template allow us to extract the data in a consistent way to allow us to effectively monitor the financial situation of the eligible CDFI. The workbook at the last tab is a quarterly compliance checklist, which basically asks a few questions about certifications, making sure the eligible CDFI is still in compliance in various aspects. The report is due quarterly. For a non-fiscal year-end quarter, it will be 45 calendar days after the end of the quarter. But if it's a fiscal year-end quarter, then the financial condition monitoring report is due 60 calendar days after the end of the eligible CDFI's fiscal year-end. Next slide. One report we are going to implement in the future, we haven't implemented yet, is Program Activities Monitoring Report. This one we haven't implemented is because this is still pending OMB final approval. The purpose of this report is really to allow each eligible CDFIs to report their impact using the bond loan to us, and then we can use those data and report the program bond, the amount of bonds we issued and then the impact the program has. It would, have metrics for various asset classes that Brian Jackson detailed, all the 12 asset classes. The impact can be measured by various metrics such as number of jobs created, for charter schools like student seats available, rental housing units available through rental housing class, asset class, etc. We contemplate to have this report being submitted no more than 60 calendar days after the end of the calendar year end when it's implemented. Right now, the impact reporting has been through us gathering information through the various secondary loan packages, which is extremely labor-intensive and, only to the extent accurate, depending on the secondary loan certification package, whether it discusses the impact. Once we implement this report, I anticipate our impact reporting to be a lot more robust. The annual assessment report is the only report out of our reporting requirements that's not submitted by the eligible CDFI or the qualified issuer. It's by a third party. So meaning for qualified issuers annual assessment, it has to be by another qualified issuer or by a third-party vendor. And for eligible CDFI's annual assessment, it can be by the qualified issuer or a third-party vendor that the eligible CDFI select. It cannot be by the assessed party themselves. So basically the intent of this report is to kind of do a mini re-underwriting of the qualified issuer and eligible CDFI. Because we mentioned during this presentation, the bond lasts up to 29 and a half years. And the third-party report is a means for us to get a comprehensive review of this approved qualified issuers and eligible CDFIs to make sure we have accurate risk monitoring of our program participants. Therefore, the report addresses similar aspects as the initial underwriting of the qualified issuers and eligible CDFIs. The report would address financial strength, portfolio management capability, internal controls, management and staffing, system and IT environment, impact methodology, and for the qualified issuers, the annual assessment would also address program administration. So it's kind of like a more very comprehensive report. And the due date typically, as spelled out in the bond loan agreement, section 5.1, is typically 180 days after the qualified issuer or eligible CDFI fiscal year end date. The eligible CDFI also need to submit a vendor certification report beforehand, before this annual assessment report is submitted. The vendor certification is due 30 days before the annual assessment is due, meaning 150 days typically before after the entity's fiscal year end. Annual assessment is used by the team and also by the credit risk management team especially for annual reestimate of the bond credit subsidy calculation reestimate. Next slide. Okay. So this slide basically give you some visual presentation of how the reporting process goes. The eligible CDFI would prepare the report and submit to the qualified issuer for review, and the report will be submitted to the master servicer trustee, typically submitted directly to the master servicer trustee's SharePoint site, Midland SharePoint site. And then we, at the Bond Guarantee Program, we typically have alerts, and we will look into those reports when they become available. And the Master Servicer Trustee also generate report on a monthly basis, detailing the report submission status, if what report has been submitted, what date, and what reports are past due. And then the Bond Guarantee Program utilize the reports to analyze the report data and perform our various portfolio management and monitoring tasks. Next slide. Okay, I think we finished the official presentation, and I'm going to hand it back to Susan Zuckfield for closing remarks, and then we're going to start the questions and answers session. Susan.
Yep, thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Brian, both of you, for presenting the information. We do have a lot of questions that have been rolling in, and we are trying to go through those now, but we're going to go ahead and start a live question and answer session. I did just want to very briefly thank everyone for your time and your patience. I know that doing presentations like this in a virtual setting are always challenging, and thank you for your patience. So with that, we will go ahead and start the questions. On 1 second, and we're going to actually, Patricia, do you have the list of questions that we can start going through? Because I know as we were going through the session, there was a lot of really good questions that came in that might be impactful for everyone listening, even though we might have already answered them.
Sure. I do have a list of questions that I've tried my best to capture from our chat feature during the webinar, so I hope if you've sent a question into the chat function, I hope we get to your question. If not, please do ask your question again. I apologize. One of the many questions that we got in the beginning involved whether or not the presentation slides would be emailed to participants or whether they would be made available on the public site. And in the coming days, we do plan on having the slides that you see in front of you posted onto the website, as well as we hope to share a recording of the webinar on it's step 2. So if you go to our CDFI Fund public website, the Bond Guarantee Program, step 2, apply, where you found the information on the webinar, you will be able to, we will update that and have the slides and the recording available there. Our next question, does or can the fund facilitate a way for CDFIs to collaborate on a bond guarantee program? I believe the answer is no. The CDFI fund does not really typically do that, but you may want to reach out to the qualified issuers. They do structure the bond application and can determine the participants. And I also invite any of our panelists and my team to add any additional context to any of the questions and responses that we're going to go through. So if I miss anything, please feel free to add some additional insight.
So, Patricia, my comment to this question is basically because we review the application submitted, we can only act as a judge, so we cannot coach. So that's why we only answer questions until a certain date before the application deadline. After that, we step back and we just, review the application. We don't pull a deal together. That's the qualified issuer's job, and we don't coach how to put it together. We do this outreach and we answer questions. That's it.
All right. Moving on to our next question. I believe this is a question with on the credit enhancements. Could this option also be used to increase the credit of any otherwise ineligible secondary borrower? For example, they pledge a letter of credit until their operations are sufficient to stand alone. So I'm going to turn that over to Brian Jackson, who is our credit lead.
Okay. So in general, I see. I think I understand. This is really about the secondary borrower. I mean, in general, secondary borrowers are underwritten by the eligible CDFI. I mean, if you approve internally through your underwriting program a secondary borrower in accordance with the policies that you provided to the CDFI fund, and it's pretty much up to the eligible CDFI whether that secondary borrower stands or requires additional enhancements with regard to their operations. You're talking from an operating standpoint. Typically, the pledge of a letter of credit or something else that we use as a PLCP or principal loss collateral provision is specific to shortfalls in the underlying collateral. So it's not typically something that we would, seek with regard to shortfalls in the secondary borrower's operating model. So that's a risk and a requirement that the also CDFI would have to determine.
We're going to move on to our next question. Can you generally cite the advantage of the bond guarantee program versus tax-exempt bonds? I imagine for the holders of the bond, it is the government guarantee. Ryan, I'm going to turn that back to you.
Yeah, I touched on that briefly during the presentation. I think the question is with regard to advantages from the investor's point of view, and there are no other third-party investors, private or public. The only quote-unquote investors is the Federal Financing Bank, and they do it as a part of their charter in support of the Treasury Department. So there's no other investors in this program.
We also received a question on where can we get templates for forms and system best practices for internal controls. Our team responded that the bond guarantee program typically doesn't issue such templates for forms or best practices, and I wanted to ask if Wendy had any additional insight or anyone else from the rest of the team wanted to add anything to that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. Our question was, where can we get templates for forms and system best practices for internal controls?
So we do not have the forms or templates for internal control. It is important for the applicant to familiarize yourself, especially if you're a nonprofit entity, with the OMB Circular A-133, which details out the control requirements for any parties participating in the federal government award programs. Not only bond guarantee program, that applies to all federal award programs. And also, the auditors are a good source. Many of the auditors would perform not only the financial reporting audit, they also perform A-133 single audit, which is for federal awards compliance audit. So the auditors would be a great source. And then the other sources of information would be, getting together with the qualified issuer and also the CDFI industry, association, for example, Opportunity Finance Network. Those are the sources. We do not have any templates for that.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, I think the main point on this is to start reaching out to those channels and ones that, if you're working with a QI already, they would be your best source of leverage for this type of information.
Great. Thank you, Wendy and Susan. Our next question is, do all credit enhancements need to be assigned to the trust estate, whether at the bond loan level or the secondary tertiary loan level? Our team responded yes.
They're automatic. Yeah, that's all credit enhancements are effectively either explicitly or through the. I'm trying to think. There's a collateral. There's a collateral agreement for the program that effectively assigns all pledged collateral into the trust estate. It's something that's closed with the closing documents. So as on a go-forward basis, as secondary borrowers or secondary loans are pledged to the program, any and all credit enhancements or collateral are effectively pledged to the trust estate automatically.
Thank you. Our next question.
Do the OC requirement?
We can wait. We have a couple more to go before that one.
Okay.
Is the liquidity premium still at 37.5 basis points? Yes, the answer is yes.
Yeah, well, for the federal financing bank, that's the 3/8 is a standard for FFB. An increase to that spread may be requested as one of those tools that we use to enhance the subsidy requirement. But again, it's a pretty standard for FFB, again, with the exception of the program's requirements to increase that if need be.
Our next question is, what is the total cost of all the fees? What would that be based on the bond amount?
Yeah, I'd go back to that chart. The only ones that we can say definitively are the ones that were shaded in our program-related fees. So those are delineated in the bond trust indenture, and you can, it's a broad brush of it in that chart. Other fees, they're negotiate with the qualified issuer or other servicers or any other organization that may be in support negotiates those fees directly with the CDFI.
Our next question, can you describe the impact of a loan payment deferral provided to eligible CDFI borrowers' loans due to an economic impact like the pandemic?
Right. So there have been no deferrals that have been approved for the eligible CDFI. And I can say that any possibility for deferrals for eligible CDFIs would be extremely challenging in the structure of the program today. Now, there have been limited deferrals granted to the secondary borrowers that we've managed over time. But any shortfall in funding or payment by the eligible CDFI has to be made up through some other source.
Yeah, and Patricia, I think this was one of those questions that we were getting in a couple of different forms from different individuals, and so I just want to make sure everyone knows, like if you have a secondary loan that needs a deferral, right, given whether it's due to the pandemic or just other reasons, generally speaking, that loan would have to be swapped out for a fully performing loan in order to remain compliant with the agreement. Given the pandemic, we do, like Brian was alluding to, we do have some capability to be able to provide temporary waivers and temporary things that we can do to provide relief on the secondary loan level, not on the bond loan level. So those bond loan payments will have to be made, but we do have some flexibility on the secondary loans. The big key is there, if you find yourself in that sort of a situation where a secondary borrower might need payment relief, you would have to come to us and get a waiver to be able to do that, to keep the loan in your portfolio.
Thank you, Susan. The next question, can eligible CDFIs only apply for bond loans in coordination with a qualified issuer, or are they able to submit a guarantee application on their own and potentially be rolled into a guarantee application or QI application submitted in the same round by a QI? And if this is allowed, does it ever happen? If the answer to that one is no, they would have to go through a qualified issuer. I don't know if, Susan, you wanted to add anything else to that one?
No, I don't have anything else to add, just that you would have to work with a QI.
And then I think some of these next questions, we weren't able to respond to them on the chat individually, so we apologize. but we'll do our best to give you the response now. Given that the level of OC will be determined in underwriting, how should ECDFIs build out the OC detailed in the sources and uses table? Would you recommend they demonstrate the 120% level that was listed as a potential requirement in last year's application?
The chances that OC would be as high as 120% is fairly thin. So they are determined during underwriting. It's very difficult to project what that OC level will be. I think the best way to get a feel for that is to talk to one of the current QIs and get a feel for other program participants and what their OC rates have been and compared to their capital structure, the capital strength. That probably gets you the closest thing. And yeah, a qualified issuer will work with an ECDFI applicant on a proposed term sheet, and that will include a proposed OC, and that will go into the capital distribution plan.
Thank you, Brian. Our next question is with regards to the PAM report that Wendy had mentioned in her last section for the presentation. Wendy described the proposed PAM report as tracking impacts that are currently difficult to track and report out. This burden will shift to the CDFIs. Will Treasury provide any tools to CDFIs to aid in preparing the report?
So the answer to that question is no, we are not shifting the burden. Now, the burden has always been with the eligible CDFI. For all the bond loan agreement that has been executed so far, if you go to the bond loan agreement section 5.1, G, like Greg, it lists out some reports, PLM report that we mentioned about, the FCM report for financial condition monitoring, and it also mentions about annual program impact monitoring report. So I think because it says annual program monitoring, program impact monitoring report, is the term, the terminology is different from the PAM report we mentioned about, but in reality, the PAM report refers to this program impact monitoring. It's just that we haven't rolled out the template workbook for all the eligible CDFIs to use. So all the eligible CDFIs have gotten a break for this past few years of submitting this annual report. Once we roll out that program activities monitoring report, it would help streamline the impact processing process, because currently we know all the eligible CDFIs already, provide impact reporting in their system, capture the impact in various different methodologies, and we believe their report will standardize and the kind of data elements we're looking for. So to summarize, it's not an additional or extra burden that's already baked into the bond loan agreement, and it's going to standardize things and make things easier.
Thank you, Wendy. The next question, can you talk about new flexibility around the OC in general and how low that could go for well-rated ECDFI? Brian, I'm going to give it.
Well, it could be zero as long as you want to use a relending account. But if you don't want to use a relending account, then there has to be some level of OC. Again, it's case by case. It's tough. It ranges in this program, I believe, from 102 to 110, right? 110. So I think 110 right now is the highest, and 102 is the lowest. And the reasons for that, again, are case by case.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Our next question is, can you provide a list of the awardees from the past 2 years?
And the answer to that is yes, and I'm trying to figure out how. I know we do a public announcement at the end of the year. If Bill is still on, maybe he could guide us to where those are housed, but I know that they are press releases. They are somewhere on our website. I just cannot figure out, or I don't know off the top of my head where to point you to that link on the website, but yes, we can get that to you. What I would say is if you want that, just send us an email to bgp@cdfi.treas.gov, and we can send you those press releases.
Thank you, Susan. And just to add to that, if you go to the CDFI Fund public website, so cdfifund.gov, I think one of the sections is Step 3 award announcement, so they should be there. I know last year's award announcement is on there. So, and again, as Susan mentioned, if you shoot us an email to the BGP email inbox, we'll be able to get you that response as well. Our next question is, would you say that the interest rates on this program are lower than tax-exempt bonds?
Yeah, that's for the borrower to determine. We don't really make a comparison.
Our next question. Oh, sorry, Susan, did I cut you off?
Nope, you're good.
Okay. Our next question, does the ECDFI have the option of pledging its own cash collateral as a credit enhancement for a secondary loan that is a construction loan?
Sure, absolutely. Understand, though, that it has to be enough cash to cover the entire principal amount of the loan. So it may not be economically viable. So usually a letter of credit is a little bit less, does the same thing, is a little less expensive than pledging 100% cash.
Okay, are secondary borrowers and ECDFIs the same?
So you need to go back to the chart of the entire funds flow or of all the players. I think that was slide 14 on this in this presentation. Is that right? Slide 14?
I believe so. I wonder if I can possibly to slide 14.
Yeah. And that really shows you where the secondary borrowers are in relation to the eligible CDFI. So the eligible CDFI is the actual obligor. They owe the money to the federal financing bank. The secondary borrower is an obligor to the eligible CDFI, but that asset, that loan, and that obligation, we consider an asset and is used as collateral to secure the money, the obligation of the eligible CDFI.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. Just to pivot back to our award announcement question, we did get a response from Bill. So you can actually find all the press releases at the bottom of the Step 3 portion of the website. Step 3 is award announcement. Okay, our next question. I think this is with regards to the OC question that we had and how low it goes, Brian. And you mentioned the relending account. How does the relending account play into it?
Oh, I see. Okay. So in the statute, this is a long one, so bear with me. In the statute, the relending account was required to capture all the payments from the secondary borrowers. So effectively, the relending account is established by the master servicer trustee and managed by the master servicer trustee. there are two very significant requirements on the relending account. One is that when that cash is captured by the relending account, the repayments from the secondary borrower, that money does not go back to the eligible CDFI. It has to be requisitioned by the eligible CDFI for further draws, as if it was a reborrowing. Now, if the eligible CDFI is unable to find sufficient collateral to do another draw in order to get money from the relending account, there's a calculation that happens every 6 months. And money that's not used goes back to prepay the federal financing bank. So that was considered particularly unwieldy. So when you over-collateralize, you do not have to use the relending account. So that's not a challenge anymore. And you basically can effectively use funds that are captured in the program at the escrow agent for further lending down the line. Was that the answer to the question?
I believe so. Why don't we do this? We'll say that it answers it, and we will just ask if you had any follow-up questions to that. Go ahead and send us a question. One thing I do just want to take a quick breath and make sure that everybody knows we are getting a lot of chats coming through right now. So if it takes us a second or if we're a little bit behind, there are chats, just coming at us left and right as we're talking these questions through. So.
Oh my, yeah.
Okay. Our next question, as Susan said, we're just going to keep going, and then you can ask follow-up questions when we're through. Would it be fair to say that the PAM report will be similar to the CDFI tertiary loan report that the CDFIs are already doing?
So I want to say no. The PAM is not similar to the tertiary loan report. The tertiary loan report, just like the pledge loan monitoring report, is more like focusing on the loan terms and characteristics. The PAM report would be focusing more exclusively on the impact of the loans. So it is because the format has not been final yet. We still have some discussion with the OMB. It is not feasible for me to give out a lot of detail, but it is not similar to the tertiary loan report.
Thank you, Wendy. Our next question, where can we learn more about the secondary loan requirements mandated for secondary borrowers, if any? So you can find more information about the SLRs on our public website. If you go to the CDFI Fund Bond site, we'll have a step 5, and the first 2 links should be related to the secondary loan requirements. These were recently updated, and so the first one is the information on the SLRs, and then the second one should be the SLR checklist. Brian, as our CRM lead, did you want to add anything else to that?
Nope, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, so the secondary loan requirements is under the Bond Guarantee Program external side under Step 5, compliance and reporting. At the top of compliance, the top document, top 2 documents are secondary loan requirements and checklist documents.
And then I think one of our qualified issuers was able to provide some extra context on when we were discussing the PAM report. And I believe she sent to us a private message stating that their message to the ECDFI is to make sure that they can specifically track, I think it's impact reporting in their policies. And so perhaps when we go into more of the questions and comments when we open it up to the rest of our participants, perhaps our qualified issuer can provide more information on that. I think those are all of the questions that we have on the chat function. And again, we apologize if we might have missed your question. It wasn't on purpose. We just got a lot at the very end. So I hope we can have our moderator open up the phone line for our participants so that they might be able to ask us questions.
Yes, if you would like to ask. I just want to add one thing right before we open it all the way up. So one thing, because I'm in case anybody starts getting off, one just resounding theme that I'm hoping that you can pick up on through these answers is, if you do have a question, obviously you can always reach out to us, and we will try our best to answer the question, but also make sure that you're utilizing the resources that are at hand. For instance, our public website has just a lot of very good resources and documents on there that you can go and read and find out more. And then your other best bet is to ask questions of your QIs. Right? That's what they're there for. That's what they're there to do, is to help you through the process. And don't be shy to go out and try to get those answers to the questions that you have. All right. And with that, why don't we go ahead and open it up and see if anyone does have a verbal question for us.
If you would like to ask a question, please dial *1, unmute your phone, and record your name clearly. If you need to withdraw your question, please dial *2. Again, to ask a question, please dial *1, and it will take just a few moments for those questions to come through.
Thank you, Madison.
And we are showing no questions on the phone side at this time.
Okay, that's probably, I think everybody used the chat feature to ask their questions. We'll go ahead and hang on for another minute or so and see if anybody has any questions or comments that might come through. And actually, I just got a question in chat, so let me go ahead and read this while we wait for verbal questions. So we have a question that says, would it be permissible under the program to offer interest-only loans to secondary borrowers? So for this one, why don't I throw this to Brian Jackson, our CRM lead, let him answer that as far as secondary borrowers.
Typically in the capital distribution plan at application, if you plan to do that, I would include that in the capital distribution plan. And then that capital distribution plan is updated every year so that we can see the impact or potential impact of spread differential of the pool of secondary loans or the type of secondary loans we plan to pledge. There is no explicit today, requirement that prevents you from pledging interest-only loans, but understand that the cash flows have to work in order to meet the payment schedule that the eligible CDFI needs to is committed to. So if you do that, you have to be very clear that it's still going to maintain that payment stream. But if there's going to be significant amount of interest, quote-unquote, interest-only loans, then that's something we would have to talk about at application to see if that's something we can accept, because obviously we couldn't accept a full pool of interest-only loans only. So it's something we have to talk about at application if it's going to be significant level in the pool.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Are there any questions over the phone lines?
We are still showing no questions at this time.
Okay. Well, let me do this. I'll open up to the panel. Any last thoughts, any closing remarks that you guys want to make, Wendy or Brian or Patricia or anyone on BGP team?
I wanted to mention to all the audience that we're very excited this year. We don't have the minimum over-collateralization requirement of 111 like we had last year. We're very excited with that, and we are really looking forward to all the applications. And although this outreach is kind of online, we can already see the enthusiasm picking up for participating in this program. And we do really look forward to next year being able to see everyone in person rather than doing this virtual session. I can't believe we're doing this virtual session for the second time. We miss you.
Yes. Wendy, I think your thoughts are echoed very well. Yeah, we definitely, it's been, what this week is exactly 1 year since we went behind camera. For those of you that may not know, I joined the CDFI fund as the Bond Guarantee Program Manager just about 1 year ago this week. So it would be really nice to finally get out and meet everyone in person rather than behind camera, but we are very excited for this year. A lot of hard work went into opening this round, and we are very excited for what could come, and we're ready for a very busy spring and summer, but it's a very good thing with this program. Brian, any final thoughts from you?
Nope, just happy to get back to work.
Well, if there are no other questions, I just want to, again, thank everyone for your participation today. And I'll, again, say that if you do think of a question later as you're reading through our website or looking at the documents, feel free to reach out to us. Email is probably the best way, bgp@cdfi.treas.gov, and let us know if you have questions. And don't forget to reach out to your QIs, as they can also help you answer questions and guide you through the process. Thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time.